The Cuban Missile Crisis is usually seen as a stroke of President Kennedy's diplomatic genius, bravery and patience. It's seen, at least in part, as the first few dominoes falling that would lead to Khrushchev's eventual fall from power just 2 years later. But was it really Khrushchev's art of the deal? Khrushchev's initiation of the Madman Theory before Presidents Nixon and Trump? After all, that's what he seemed to think it was. In the next few minutes, this was Khrushchev's take on it and how, despite how it might have looked, he played a bluff and got exactly what he wanted. The standard narrative, especially good for television and movie scripts and YouTube videos, is that overall the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba in September 1962 ended in a diplomatic failure for the U.S.S.R. After all, the missiles were removed just months later. But as Khrushchev writes in his memoirs, the beautifully titled Khrushchev Remembers, sounding more like a lovey-dovey romance movie, quote, "The Caribbean crisis, as it was called in the Soviet Union, was a triumph of Soviet foreign policy and a personal triumph in my own career as a statesman and as a member of the collective leadership. We achieved, I would say, a spectacular success without having to fire a single shot." Usually, the history story begins in September 1962 in Cuba, but the Cold War was global and began way before 1962. In the previous years, Khrushchev had been given two issues to deal with. First, the survival of Castro's Cuba and preventing any larger war that might come from US involvement there, and second, US missiles that had been parked on the borders of the U.S.S.R. As Khrushchev says, "We were sure that the Americans would never reconcile themselves to the existence of Castro's Cuba. This question was constantly on my mind. Everyone agreed that America would not leave Cuba alone unless we did something." And second, the United States had already surrounded the Soviet Union with its own bomber bases and missiles in Turkey and Italy, to say nothing of West Germany. I found myself in the difficult position of having to decide on a course of action which would answer the American threat, but which would also avoid war. In this context, the decision to put nuclear missiles in Cuba that Khrushchev came up with while visiting Bulgaria, and the missile crisis that followed, was a bargaining chip to avert a second Bay of Pigs, and either remove or at least neutralize the nuclear missiles around the USSR's borders. This was Nixon and Kissinger's Madman Theory and President Trump's art of the deal many years before. State or give off an intention well beyond that you're looking for, and after negotiating, after they've backed down from the madman or calmed the madman down, you get what you actually wanted in the beginning anyway. Quote, "When we put our ballistic missiles in Cuba, we had no desire to start a war. On the contrary, our principal aim was only to deter America from starting a war. Our goal was precisely the opposite. We wanted to keep the Americans from invading Cuba." After the crisis had cooled down, Khrushchev, both outside the Eastern Bloc and among some of his generals and some Politburo members, was painted as having backed down, having been bullied out of a position of strength, or of being a madman that luckily hadn't carried out his threats. Castro himself viewed it this way, refusing for a while afterwards to receive the Soviet ambassador. Kennedy certainly proved himself as a president during the crisis, but US missiles were removed from Turkey and a formal pledge to not invade Cuba was made by the US. Khrushchev wrote, "It was a great victory for us." Like the two sides had different names for the crisis, they also had different ways of interpreting it.